The photograph came to me in a cardboard box, nestled among old letters and church bulletins. I run a small historical preservation business in Charleston, restoring old photographs and documents for families who want to preserve their heritage. This particular job had been commissioned by Eleanor Hastings, an elderly woman who'd recently inherited her grandmother's estate. "There's a wedding photograph," she'd told me over the phone. "From 1901, my great-grandmother's wedding. The family has always said there was something odd about it, but no one would ever tell me what. I'd like it restored and digitized. Maybe you'll see what they were talking about." The photograph was large for its era, mounted on thick cardboard backing. It showed a wedding party of perhaps 20 people, arranged in 2 rows, standing and seated, in front of what appeared to be a grand house, with climbing vines covering the walls. The women wore elaborate white dresses, with enormous decorative hats adorned with flowers and feathers. The men were in dark formal suits. In the center of the front row sat a bride and groom, the bride holding a massive cascading bouquet. It was a beautiful image, remarkably well preserved for its age, the kind of photograph that captured a moment of joy and celebration. A family at their finest, on what must have been one of the most important days of their lives. I began the restoration process, carefully scanning the image at high resolution. As the digital file loaded on my screen, I zoomed in to examine different sections, looking for damage that needed repair, spots that needed cleaning, areas where the emulsion had degraded. That's when I saw him. In the background, partially obscured by the climbing vines and the foliage, was a figure. A man, standing in the shadows at the left edge of the photograph, behind and to the side of the wedding party. He wasn't part of the formal arrangement. He stood apart, watching. At first, I thought he might be a servant or a photographer's assistant, someone who'd accidentally stepped into frame during the exposure. But as I enhanced the image, adjusting brightness and contrast, I realized there was something very wrong about this figure. His clothes were different from everyone else's. While the wedding party wore the formal, elaborate fashions of 1901, this man wore what looked like much older clothing, perhaps from the 1860s or 1870s. A long, dark coat, a wide-brimmed hat, and his face, when I zoomed in on it, was indistinct, blurred, as though he'd been moving during the exposure. But everyone else in the photograph was perfectly sharp, perfectly still. Only this figure showed motion blur. And his eyes. Even through the blur, even across more than a century of photographic degradation, his eyes seemed to be staring directly at the camera. At me. I sat back from my computer, unsettled. I'd restored hundreds of old photographs. I'd seen all kinds of anomalies, light leaks, chemical stains, developing errors. But this felt different. This felt deliberate. I called Eleanor Hastings. "I've started working on your great-grandmother's wedding photograph. Can you tell me anything about the family's concerns about it?" There was a long pause. "My mother never wanted to talk about it. She said her grandmother, the bride, had kept the photograph hidden for most of her life. Only brought it out once, when my mother was a teenager, and told her never to show it to anyone. Said there was
Someone in it who shouldn't be there.
Did she say who?
No. Just that he'd been dead for 30 years when the photograph was taken. My mouth went dry. Dead for 30 years. So this person died around 1871. I suppose so, yes. Do you see something in the photograph? I described the figure in the background. Eleanor was silent for so long I thought the corn had dropped. Eleanor? My great-grandmother's first husband, she said quietly. He died in 1870, before she married my great-grandfather in 1901. His name was William Garrett. He died in the Civil War, well, technically after it, in 1870, from wounds he'd received during the war. I zoomed in on the figure again. Do you have any photographs of William Garrett? I think so. Let me look through the papers. I'll scan and send you what I find. An hour later, my email pinged. Eleanor had sent 3 images. The first was a formal portrait of a young man in a Confederate uniform, dated 1863. The second was a damaged tintype showing the same man, older, thinner, still in uniform. The third was a newspaper clipping, an obituary. William Garrett, aged 28, died Tuesday last at his home on Meeting Street. Mr. Garrett served with the 1st South Carolina Infantry and was wounded at the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. Though he survived the war, his injuries never fully healed, and he has succumbed at last to complications arising therefrom. He is survived by his wife, Catherine Beaumont Garrett, and his parents. I compared the portrait to the figure in the wedding photograph. Even accounting for the blur, the similarity was undeniable. The same build, the same posture, the same wide-brimmed hat style that Confederate soldiers had favored. William Garrett, dead for 31 years, appearing in his widow's 2nd wedding photograph. I continued the restoration work, but I couldn't stop thinking about that figure. I tried different enhancement techniques, different filters, hoping to bring more clarity to his image. Nothing worked. He remained blurred, indistinct, as though existing on a different plane from everyone else in the photograph. But as I worked, I noticed other details I'd missed initially. The wedding party's expressions. Most of them smiled or maintained the neutral, formal expressions typical of the era. But a few, particularly the older women in the back row, looked tense, uncomfortable. And several people in the photograph weren't looking at the camera. They were looking to the left, toward where the figure stood in the shadows, as though they could see him. I found more information about the wedding through online genealogical records. Catherine Beaumont Garrett, widow, had married Richard Hastings on June 15, 1901, at the Hastings family home on Tradd Street in Charleston. It had been a small but elegant affair, family only, held in the garden. The newspaper society page had mentioned it. A quiet but tasteful ceremony united Mrs. Catherine Garrett and Mr. Richard Hastings in matrimony on Saturday last. Mrs. Hastings is well known in Charleston society, having been widowed in 1870. She brings to the marriage considerable property and social standing. I searched for more details about William Garrett's death. The newspaper archives yielded several articles. He'd been wounded at Spotsylvania in 1864, shot through the chest. He'd survived,
miraculously, though the bullet had remained lodged near his spine. He'd come home to Charleston after Lee's surrender, married Catherine Beaumont in the summer of 1865, and had lived another 5 years, growing progressively weaker as infection and complications from the wound slowly killed him. One article, from a few days after his death, mentioned something that made me pause. Mr. Garrett's widow reports that, in his final days, he became convinced that he would not truly leave this world, that his death was not an end, but merely a change of state. He made her promise that she would always remember him, always acknowledge his existence, even should she remarry. Mrs. Garrett, devoted to the end, gave him this promise. Always acknowledge his existence, even should she remarry. And then, 31 years later, William Garrett had appeared in Catherine's second wedding photograph. I worked on the restoration for another week, carefully repairing damage, enhancing details, bringing the image back to something close to its original clarity. But I left the figure in the background untouched. I couldn't bring myself to try to remove him or obscure him. He was part of the photograph, part of the story, whether anyone wanted him there or not. When I sent the completed restoration to Eleanor, I included a detailed report of everything I'd found. The figure in the background, the comparison to William Garrett's portrait, the historical context. I expected her to be disturbed or upset. Instead, she called me, and she was crying. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for not pretending you didn't see him, for not editing him out or telling me it was just a shadow or a developing error." "You're not upset?" "No. I'm relieved, I think. My whole life, people have acted like this photograph was shameful, like there was something wrong with my great-grandmother for keeping it. But now I understand. She wasn't haunted by guilt. She was keeping a promise. To always acknowledge his existence, I said. Yes. Even at her second wedding. Even in the moment when she was moving on with her life. She made sure he was acknowledged. She made sure he was there. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. Catherine Garrett had loved William enough to promise him he would never be forgotten. And when she remarried, 31 years after his death, that promise had somehow manifested in the wedding photograph. William had been there, watching from the shadows, a witness to the ceremony. But had Catherine known he would appear in the photograph? Had she asked him to be there? Or had he simply come? I decided to dig deeper. I found Catherine's obituary from 1935. She'd lived to be 92 years old, outliving her second husband by 15 years. The obituary mentioned that she'd been a devoted wife to 2 husbands, both now deceased, and that she'd spent her final years quietly, rarely leaving her home on Trad Street. That home was still standing. I'd passed it dozens of times without knowing its history. It was a private residence now, beautifully maintained, one of Charleston's many historic houses. On impulse, I wrote to the current owners, explaining my work on the wedding photograph and asking if they knew anything about the house's history. To my surprise, They wrote back immediately. "We've owned the house for 12 years," they wrote. "And yes, we know about Catherine Garrett Hastings. There's still a portrait of her in one of the upstairs bedrooms. The previous owners left it, said it belonged with the house. But there's something else you should know. There are 2 portraits in that bedroom. One is Catherine. The other is a Confederate soldier. We were told by the previous owners that the portraits must always remain together, that Catherine requested it in some long-ago will or letter. We've honored that request, even though we don't know the full story. They invited me to come see the portraits. I went the following week. The bedroom was lovely, filled with afternoon sunlight, furnished with antiques that might have been original to the house. On the wall above a small writing desk hung 2 portraits in matching frames. Catherine, painted when she was perhaps 40 or 50, wearing a dark blue dress, her hair styled in the fashion of the 1880s. She looked serene, composed, with a slight smile that suggested contentment. And beside her, William. The portrait must have been painted from the 1863 photograph, because he appeared young, healthy, wearing his Confederate uniform. But the artist had given him the same expression Catherine wore. Serene, content, at peace. They hung side by side, their frames touching, as though they were still together. The homeowners told me that sometimes, late at night, they heard footsteps in that bedroom. Slow, measured steps, like someone pacing. But when they checked, the room was always empty.
"We've never felt threatened by it," the wife said. "It's more like someone keeping watch, someone making sure the house is safe." I stood in that bedroom for a long time, looking at the portraits, thinking about Catherine and William and Richard, about love and memory and promises that transcended death. Catherine had married Richard Hastings in 1901, had built a new life with him, had been happy by all accounts. But she'd never forgotten her first husband. She'd kept his portrait in her bedroom for more than 60 years. She'd honored her promise to acknowledge his existence. And somehow, he'd been present at her second wedding, appearing in the photograph, even though he'd been dead for 31 years. I returned to my studio and looked at the wedding photograph again. I'd sent Eleanor the restored version, but I'd kept high-resolution copies for my own records. I zoomed in on William's figure, studying every detail I could make out through the blur. And I noticed something I'd missed before. His hand. It was raised slightly, at waist height, in what might have been a gesture of blessing or acknowledgement. Not threatening, not angry, just present, acknowledging, accepting. William Garrett had come to his widow's wedding to give his blessing. The thought made me cry, which surprised me. I'd worked on hundreds of historical photographs, had read countless stories of loss and grief and death. But this one felt different. This one felt like a testament to the idea that love doesn't end when life does. I created a full historical report on the photograph, documenting everything I'd learned. Eleanor asked if she could donate it to the Charleston Historical Society, along with the restored photograph and the other materials she'd found. I agreed and helped her prepare the donation. The photograph is on display now in the Society's Love and Loss in the Old South exhibit.
The placard beside it reads, "Wedding of Catherine Beaumont Garrett and Richard Hastings, June 15, 1901. Note the figure in the background, believed to be the spirit of Catherine's first husband, William Garrett, who died in 1870. Family tradition holds that Catherine had promised William he would never be forgotten, and that his appearance in this photograph represents the fulfillment of that promise. The photograph was kept private by the family for more than a century."
Visitors stopped to stare at it, trying to make out the blurred figure in the shadows. Some are skeptics, looking for evidence of photographic manipulation. Others are believers, finding comfort in the idea that love can persist beyond death. I visit the exhibit sometimes, standing quietly in the back of the room, watching people's reactions. And I think about Catherine, who lived her life honoring two loves, who made room in her heart for both past and future, who kept a promise, even when it might have been easier to forget. The photograph captures a moment of joy, a wedding, a new beginning. But it also captures something more: the continuing presence of the past, the persistence of memory, the way love creates bonds that even death cannot sever. William Garrett died in 1870, but on June 15, 1901, he stood in the shadows of his former home and watched his widow marry again. Not with anger or jealousy, but with that raised hand that might have been blessing. Acceptance. Love. And the camera, that strange device that captures light and time, and sometimes more than we intend, preserved his presence forever. A stranger in the wedding photograph. Except he wasn't a stranger at all. He was exactly where he'd promised to be, exactly where Catherine had promised he would always be. Acknowledged, forever present, forever loved, forever part of the story. The photograph hangs in the Historical Society, behind glass, carefully preserved.
The wedding party smiles or maintains their formal expressions. The elaborate hats cast their shadows. The flowers bloom forever in that captured June afternoon. And in the background, in the shadows, William Garrett stands watch, still keeping his promise, still acknowledged, still, after all these years, exactly where love placed him.